Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Celebrity Reads. This is going to be another quiet one because there is a baby sleeping right next to me. Um, I just finished a book called The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. Just want to talk a little bit about it. It's written in 1974. Spoiler alert, by the way. Definitely going to talk in depth about what happens. Main premise is, there's a scientist who ends up leaving his world to go to a new world. That's like Cliff Notes, no spoilers version of the story. It was definitely one of the more impactful books I've ever read. I thought, first it was incredibly Marxist or class conscious. The idea of revolution and of freedom defined um, Anaris, I think Aris, how you pronounce it. Goodness, I should know how to pronounce it for this video. Anyway, I'll just refer to it as society on the moon versus society on quote unquote Earth. And they left Earth because of these unequal situations and exploitation, and people living in poverty to live in a new world, and they had nothing in that world, but they had each other. It was a really strong sense of community, and so I think a lot of times humans, like, we envision in utopias where we can have the material excesses of capitalism while also the strong communal spirit or greater sense of equality that's more discussed in socialism and Marxism. And I think this book really shows us that, or at least according to Ursula Le Guin, that you can't have everything, right? That's why it's called an ambiguous utopia, right? Because it is utopian in the sense that there is trust, and everyone goes through the same thing. Everyone has relatively equal access to things, but at the same time, you don't have, the moon that they live on does not have the resources or same habitable land that the earth does, and so they have to make a lot of sacrifices. I think one of the really most important parts of what makes Svek such an interesting character, and also what makes the novel so compelling, is that it talks about suffering, it talks about failure, it talks about frustration. Suffering is a huge part of the book, and it really makes me think a lot about Buddhism because of how deeply it's entwined in everything. Right? Originally, the people who left the earth to go to the moon left because of this suffering, because they were suffering, and they knew the quote unquote owners or the profiteers or the people who owned the society and made money off of everyone else were not. And they knew that the only way for them to change it was to leave, right? And so you would think that they did escape that type of suffering, the suffering that is a systematic suffering that is designed as part of the system that exploits wealth and distributes it unequally. However, they also experience other types of suffering, right? Middle late part of the book, Svek, is going through his life because the book is told in two different parts. One part is when he is gone to Earth. The other part is his backstory. And so, you know, which I think is interesting because, there's a lot of things about time that are in the book. And so that's really fascinating, but I'm not going to get distracted, hopefully. Um, so to continue where I was going, in that time in the book, they suffered so much. They were having these long droughts, and so everyone had to pitch in and all this stuff, and so not only were people starving, people were not hungry. There were people who were, because the trains were communal trains, they had their own destination. But there were people who tried to fight to, overtake the trains because their communities were starving, and the train of grain or food was not for them. There was a train person who talked about having to run over trains. Svek, when he was living through that, he had to be someone in charge of sort of the schedules of who would starve and who would not starve. And eventually he had to quit because of that. But, I think that says a lot about it. But the one thing that did happen, through that sort of community suffering is everyone was suffering together, and everyone felt that they were all contributing to their survival. And so that was something that was discussed, was that there was a lot of joy and work and challenge, and people were suffering, but they all knew that they were working together as a community. They're really scary moments, but because of the sense of shared equality and really strong sense of community, in some ways it brought them together. And though they suffered greatly, their society was not, decimated in the same sense that it could be. There were great inequalities, and only one class suffered because of them. To bring it back to time, a lot of physics in the book also, which I thought was incredible, and I know nothing about physics, but, I really think about, okay, first chapter is him arriving or leaving his home. Last chapter is him returning, right? And so there's this whole conversation within the book about time. How does time work, right? This whole classic problem of throwing apple to a tree. Well, mathematically, if you keep, dividing the time between, the space between the apple and the tree, you'll never reach the tree. It'll infinitely be going at the tree. But in real life, it hits the tree, right? And so I think this whole conversation is about circular versus linear time. A circular time would be, you know, the cycles, the seasons, the way our planets orbit the Earth. It's repeated. It creates this sort of order versus linear time, which is the time that we experience, but they happen simultaneously. Like the circular time is like one human life, another human is born, lives through life, passes away, born, lives through life, passes away, right? At the same time, if you look within a society or a generation of people, then you see a progression of time and change and all that stuff. And so the way it was done narratively with these chapters sort of underlines this thing. And there was this also strong feeling of coming home. And what does that mean? And what does home mean, right? Because Shrek felt like an exile, not only, like before he even left, he felt like an exile on his own planet. Or on his own moon, because that's what it was. I mean, they were constantly fighting against the system so they could find their freedom, right? It's just ironic, right? Because hundreds of years ago, this group of people left the earth to find freedom. They were anarchists, and community was everything. But eventually, slowly, in setting up this society, people lost their freedom to really choose, and people decided to just follow the system instead of having their own agency. And it's very fascinating because it's about the progression of time and how ideals and ideas can change because of the circumstances that were given to the community, right? Every time a crisis happens and the community becomes more and more controlled as a way of survival, but that doesn't go away once the crisis has passed. So I thought that was really fascinating, but that's the most fascinating part, honestly, because, and if you think about like foils and relationships, like especially on the moon, Svek's foil of Sepul, I think exemplifies why the book is called Ambiguous Utopia, because Svek has these theories that are so far beyond and advanced and not in the popular sort of canon of what physicists are doing. And so Sepul, he doesn't even write physics. He just takes credit for other people's ideas, and he controls the way that information is shared. And so he's the definition of a political figure in a society that supposedly abolished politics, right? And so Svek having to fight against this man in order to advance his career, in order to even share his ideas within this quote-unquote utopian society, I think it really underlines the point of how does human nature play into this? Human's desire for power, the human desire for control, all of that stuff, and how politics can become central to someone who lives in a society that is supposedly beyond politics. That it was really funny the way the conversations changed and how naive Shvek was at the beginning of the book when he was left on the moon versus before he was leaving towards the end of the book, where they talk purely about politics and how things are going to be, and having to think multiple steps ahead of people's different interests and what they're going to have to do in order to achieve their aims because of how political it has become, even though that was the opposite of the ideal. Okay, to switch gears. When he was living on Earth, which I apologize for not knowing the names. I'm sure I should have looked them up before the video, but you know, here he is surrounded by wild beauty, but he for a long time he doesn't really even see the average person. because they were invisible. They were, and I think that says a lot about our capitalist society and a lot about how inequality can continue to persist because it's not visible. Like in his society, and he talked about this when he goes down the shopping street, which he considered hell, because of how much excess there was, right? Because capitalism is excess. This world has so much resources, so they just produce so many things. Whereas his world, there is nothing excess, and anything considered excess is even the water faucets turn off on their own and on the moon planet because of that, right? So anyway, get back to it, right? So capitalism, these people are invisible. He cannot see them. He doesn't. The only person he really sees is Butler. He doesn't see the people who clean the buildings, the people who get rid of sewage, the trash people, all that stuff. And so I think that says a lot about our world too. You know, we, I'm someone who lives in the